The moment I realized something was wrong wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slam doors, just my phone lighting up with my mother's name, then going dark again before I could answer. I was 19, sitting in the back row of a crowded lecture hall, my notebook open, my mind already half fractured between school and home. I texted her in class, "We'll call later," and slid the phone face down like I always did. By the time I got back to the apartment that evening, the silence had already hardened. The lights were on. Everything was clean in that overly intentional way. Counters wiped, shoes aligned, nothing out of place. That was how I knew. When my mom was angry, she cleaned. When she was furious, she went quiet. I said, closing the door softly behind me. No answer. From a kitchen, I could hear plates clinking. My younger brother Mark was already seated at the table, scrolling on his phone. He was 22, freshly graduated, temporarily figuring things out, which meant my mom covered his expenses while reminding everyone how proud she was of him. I was the opposite, still studying, working part-time, paying part of the rent, and constantly reminded how much of a burden I was. She set 2 plates on the table, not 3. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for her to notice. She didn't. She moved past me like I was furniture. "I can make something," I offered, gesturing weakly toward the stove. She didn't look at me. "Don't trouble yourself," she said calmly. "You're very busy these days." Mark shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. He never did. Silence was his survival strategy too, just a more rewarded one. I ate cereal in my room that night, sitting on the bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, replaying the day. The missed call, the text, the way my chest tightened every time I heard her footsteps in the hallway, wondering if she'd suddenly knock and explode. She didn't. That was worse. The next morning, she didn't say good morning. She didn't ask about my class schedule. When I told her I'd be home late because of work, she nodded once without looking at me, like I was a stranger updating a landlord. By the 3rd day, I was unraveling. I finally knocked on her bedroom door, heart pounding like I was about to confess to a crime. "Did I do something?" I asked through the door. A long pause. I could hear her moving inside, deliberately slow. "I don't want to argue," she said. "You always do this. You make everything emotional." "There you go," she interrupted. "See, this is why it's exhausting to talk to you." That was the conversation. Or rather, that was the end of it. I learned early that asking for clarification was framed as aggression. Any attempt to defend myself was labeled talking back. Crying meant I was unstable. Staying calm meant I was cold. Silence was the only acceptable option, but even then, it was never quite right. If I stayed quiet, she'd tell relatives, "She's finally learning her place." If I spoke, she'd sigh and say, "She's always been difficult." Mark once joked at dinner, "You should come with a user manual." Everyone laughed, including me, because not laughing would have meant another week of this. At 19, I paid for my phone, my clothes, my transportation, and part of the rent. But I still had to justify where I went, who I talked to, why I looked tired, why I was so distant lately. If I stayed out past 10, she wouldn't yell. She'd just stop acknowledging my existence. No eye contact, no responses, no food left for me, just absence. It messes with you, that kind of quiet. You start replaying every interaction, scanning for mistakes. You apologize for things you don't remember doing. You send messages like, "Sorry if I upset you," and "I didn't mean it like that," and "I'll do better," without knowing what better even means. She read every message. She never replied. A week later, she was suddenly normal again. Cheerful, warm, making jokes, telling me about a show she'd watched, acting like the silence hadn't happened at all. When I brought it up, carefully, gently, she frowned. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're imagining things." That was the first time I felt the ground shift under my feet. I started keeping notes, dates, comments, little things. Not because I wanted proof, just because I was scared I was losing my grip on reality. "You're too sensitive." I was just joking. "You always remember things wrong. Why can't you be more like your brother?" Mark, meanwhile, could do no wrong. If he forgot her birthday, it was because he was stressed. If I forgot to take out the trash, it was proof I was selfish. If he raised his voice, he was passionate. If I did, I was disrespectful. The strangest part was how often people praised me, for being quiet. You're so mature. You're easy to live with. You never caused trouble. They didn't see the cost. They didn't see how every word I swallowed turned into a knot in my chest. How I learned to speak softly, move carefully, exist minimally. How my silence wasn't peace, it was armor. Back then, I still believed if I stayed quiet long enough, gentle enough, small enough, things would get better. I didn't yet understand that my silence wasn't protecting me. It was teaching them exactly how far they could go that I didn't realize it at first. But the silent punishment was only the tip of the iceberg. By the time I turned 20, I was living in a carefully constructed prison where the bars were invisible and the guards smiled while pretending to care. It started with small suggestions. My mother would casually remark on my schedule, my clothes, even my posture. You know, staying up that late isn't healthy, she'd say, watching me scroll through social media in bed. You'll never get anywhere if you don't take care of yourself. It sounded reasonable, at least at first. So I'd nod, adjust my behavior. But then, somehow I was still wrong. My hair wasn't neat enough. My shirts weren't ironed. My voice was too loud in the morning. "Why do you insist on waking me up?" she asked once, feigning exhaustion when I was only leaving for an early shift. My brother never got these remarks. If he came home after midnight, he was working hard or living his life. If he wore wrinkled clothes, she'd laugh it off and tell him to relax. If I wore wrinkled clothes, I was lazy and careless. She never said these things with anger. She said them with a calmness so precise it was almost hypnotic. The words sank in like water into a sponge. Over time, I started questioning everything. Was I lazy? Was I careless? Was I too emotional, too sensitive, too weak? When I tried to explain how I felt, she would tilt her head, the perfect picture of concern, and say, "You're overreacting. You always overreact. I'm just trying to help." I couldn't fight it. She had a way of turning even my own words against me. "See, you think everything is about you," she said once, after I cried silently in my room for what felt like the 100th time. "You can't take care of yourself, yet you think the world should revolve around you." Mark noticed it too. He would sometimes give me sympathetic looks, but never intervened. And why would he? He was safe. He was the golden child. He didn't need to defend me. I wasn't supposed to need defending. One night, I was doing the dishes when she came up behind me, standing just close enough that I could feel her presence without her touching me. "You don't need to wash those so thoroughly," she said, her voice soft. "It's fine if you leave a few spots. Nobody will care but you." I froze, soap suds slipping from my hands. I want things clean," I muttered. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper only I could hear. "You're so intense sometimes. Don't you know it's okay to let things be?" I realized then, every time I tried to do something right, I was wrong. Every time I did nothing, I was wrong. I was trapped between the invisible rules, and no one else saw them. It wasn't just about chores or manners. It was everything. How I laughed, how I cried, how I argued, how I didn't argue. Each day, I learned the subtle cues of approval and disapproval. A single sigh could set me spiraling. A faint smile could feel like heaven. I started keeping my own secret diary. I wrote down every passive-aggressive comment, every slight, every moment of coldness. Some nights I'd read it back and feel furious. Other nights, it was all I had to remind myself that I wasn't crazy. That someone in the world, my own hand on the page, saw what was happening. College offered a brief escape. My professors treated me normally. My classmates didn't comment on my every gesture. But even then, I brought the tension home. My mother's words lingered, echoing in my mind whenever I laughed too loudly or stayed up too late studying. Once, I brought a friend home for coffee. She was bubbly, warm, the kind of person who fills a room with laughter. My mother watched quietly as we sat at the kitchen table. After my friend left, she said, "You spend too much time with people like her. She's not practical, not serious. She'll distract you." I couldn't tell if she was warning me or punishing me. Maybe both. Then came the first betrayal, the one that broke something fragile inside me. I had been seeing a therapist for months, secretly trying to understand why I felt so exhausted all the time. My mother found out. Through a receipt she glanced at while sorting my mail. She didn't confront me directly. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, she used Mark as a messenger. Mom said she's worried about you, he said one night, tossing a folded note onto my bed. She thinks maybe you're exaggerating. I froze, staring at the words. My own voice in my head screamed, "You've been confiding in someone you trusted, and now it's turned against you." Mark didn't meet my eyes. He had learned his role perfectly. He was never to challenge her. He was never to protect me. Just a golden child, floating through, untouched. The next few weeks were a careful dance. My mother would mention therapy in passing. "I hope your therapist doesn't fill your head with nonsense," she'd say, "or you shouldn't trust someone who doesn't know your family." She never asked what we discussed. She just needed me to feel that familiar knot of doubt in my chest. I did. Every time. It was then I began to understand the strings. They weren't ropes, not exactly. They were more subtle, like invisible threads that tugged on your mind. I could feel them tightening when I smiled too much, when I stayed out too late, when I dared to think I deserved kindness. They were tangled into my decisions, my thoughts, my moods. And the strangest thing? They were completely unnoticeable to anyone else. Friends saw a quiet, polite, obedient child. My brother saw nothing. My mother acted as though her care was generous and unconditional. By now, I had perfected the art of silence. I spoke only when spoken to. I nodded, smiled, avoided mistakes, erased myself from the spaces I occupied. I stopped expecting praise. I stopped expecting fairness. I even started convincing myself it was normal, that all families had rules like this, subtle punishments and quiet manipulations. That maybe I was just too sensitive, too flawed, too emotional. But beneath that careful surface, something in me began to simmer. Every small betrayal, every word twisted into control, every invisible tug planted seeds of recognition. I didn't know it yet, but this simmering wasn't despair. It was the slow awakening to my own mind, my own boundaries, my own capacity to survive. And when you are silent for long enough, people underestimate you. They think you are weak. They think you'll never fight back. They are wrong to be. By the time I turned 21, I had become an expert at living in the shadows of my own home. I was silent, cautious, constantly measuring my words and movements. I could almost move through the apartment without disturbing a single molecule of air. And yet, the pressure never lifted. It only intensified because I had started to notice patterns I couldn't ignore. It began with Mark, who for the first time slipped. He wasn't malicious. He was careful, conditioned. But one evening, after a particularly exhausting week at college and work, he laughed at something my mother said at dinner, an offhand remark that had been aimed directly at me. "You're being ridiculous," she said, smiling sweetly. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. The way she smiled at him, the ease, the lightness. It was the same smile she never gave me. "I mean, come on," Mark said, shrugging. "I'm just saying." Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a gentle, approving touch. No words, but the message was clear. This one is mine. The other? Not so much. I realized then that her manipulations weren't random. They were carefully distributed, like a map. Mark was her golden child. I was the cautionary tale. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, replaying the week, the month, the years. Every slight, every comment, every absence of warmth, it was deliberate. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I had started volunteering at a local community center, trying to find some sense of worth outside of home. I told my mother casually, "I'm helping out at the center on Saturdays. It's just a few hours." Her eyes flicked up from her phone, sharp, assessing. "Just don't overcommit yourself," she said. "I wouldn't want you to burn out." The words were harmless enough, but the tone, the underlying suggestion, was crushing. "You will overcommit. You will fail. You are not capable." I smiled anyway. Of course. 2 weeks later, she found a way to remind me of my supposed failures. I came home late after a long Saturday shift, expecting silence. Instead, she was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "You think just because you do something good for someone else, you're exempt from responsibility here?" she asked calmly. "The apartment isn't going to clean itself." I didn't. "Don't start. Don't talk back. You're always justifying yourself." I felt my stomach twist. This was the same cycle, the same invisible trap. And yet this time something shifted. Instead of shrinking, I froze. I realized I wasn't arguing with her. I was arguing with the entire architecture of control she had built around me. Later that night, I went to my room, closed the door, and finally allowed myself to cry. Not softly, not in silence. I screamed into my pillow, angry, exhausted, aware for the first time of the depth of manipulation I had endured. It was a small, personal revolution. The next morning, I started noticing the gaslighting more clearly. Conversations replayed in my head, and suddenly the inconsistencies stood out. "You always do this," she would say. But I remembered clearly when I didn't. "You're imagining things," she would tell me. But I remembered the exact words, the exact look in her eyes. "You're too sensitive," she said endlessly. But I wasn't sensitive. I was human. And now I could see it. The betrayal by Mark weighed on me too. He never sided with me. Not once. Not when she belittled me at the dinner table. Not when she dismissed my achievements. Not even when I quietly told him I was struggling. His silence was complicity. I started planning small experiments. I tested her reactions. I spoke slightly louder just to see if she would comment. I left a dish dirty on the counter and watched her notice. But instead of exploding, she ignored it for hours, then commented mildly, as though expecting me to self-flagellate silently. I realized then, her power didn't come from her words alone. It came from my compliance. My silence was her fuel. I began to map her strategies. Selective affection, praise from Mark. Conditional warmth for me. Inconsistent expectations. No action could ever be enough. Gaslighting. Deny events, twist memories. Make me question my own mind. Subtle punishment. Cold shoulder, withdrawal of attention. Insinuations, guilt tripping. Emotional blackmail. "I'm worried about you," when she was really controlling me. Armed with awareness, I started to reclaim small bits of myself. I began answering her text messages without apology. I started expressing opinions about harmless topics and observing the consequences. She noticed, of course, but couldn't escalate as quickly. One evening, after months of careful testing, I saw a crack in the mask. I had spent the afternoon volunteering, helping a child learn to read. When I came home, she said softly, "You're different lately." I froze, expecting a trap. "What do you mean?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I don't know. You seem quieter, more self-contained." "I like it." I laughed quietly to myself. She thought I was quiet because she had broken me. But in reality, I was quiet because I was learning. I was observing. I was gathering strength. By this point, I started noticing my own patterns. I realized I had spent years apologizing for existing. Years shrinking, muting, editing myself in real time. And suddenly, I didn't want any more. But I was careful. Patience became my weapon. Silence had been her tool. Now it became mine. I didn't confront her. I didn't lash out. I simply started building boundaries, slowly, deliberately. Small acts at first. Refusing to answer her calls immediately. Taking longer to comply with her instructions. Leaving the apartment for errands without announcing every step. Each act was terrifying. Each act was exhilarating. Each act chipped away at the invisible cage she had built. And the strangest part? She couldn't predict it. She couldn't control me the same way anymore. Every subtle manipulation I had absorbed for years now bounced back in her system. Harmless to me, but disorienting to her. The first real victory came one Sunday morning. I woke up, stretched, and decided to make coffee for myself without asking her permission. She noticed. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years. A small, silent rebellion that cost me nothing but my fear. That afternoon, I realized understanding the manipulation is one thing. Recognizing it is another. And acting, truly acting, is the start of freedom. I wasn't free yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time I could see the strings. And seeing them was the beginning of cutting them. By now, I knew something critical. People who underestimate the silent ones do so because they mistake quiet for submission. But I had been silent for so long that when I finally decided not to be, the effect would be nothing short of startling. I was learning that silence is not weakness. It can be armor, observation, strategy. And I was ready to put it to use. The days after that small victory were intoxicating. Every minor act of autonomy became a private triumph. I walked through the apartment with a quiet sense of purpose, keeping careful track of how she reacted, how Mark reacted, how I reacted to myself. It was as if I had discovered a hidden layer of reality, a new dimension where I could observe and participate at the same time. It started subtly. I began answering her questions on my own terms. Not immediately, not in the soft, apologetic tone she had conditioned me to use for years. I paused. I considered. Then I responded honestly. "What time will you be home?" she asked one evening. "About 7, I said, closing my notebook with deliberate calm. "No sai, no fron. No, that's too late." Just her eyes flicking up, a fraction of doubt in their depth. And for the first time, I noticed how often she tried to manipulate me with language rather than outright confrontation. Every sentence she spoke had a double meaning, a hidden command or a disguised accusation. The skill was subtle, a weapon so honed it had been invisible to me for years. But now it wasn't. Now I could see it. A week later, the first real test came. I had been accepted for an internship in a city 2 hours away. It was prestigious, demanding, and exactly the kind of opportunity one had been chasing. I told my mother cautiously, bracing myself for the inevitable reaction. "Oh, that's wonderful," she said, voice light, almost sweet. I froze. The tone was unfamiliar. Too cheerful, too controlled. It was the calm before a storm. "You'll need to think carefully about the move," she added. "Are you sure you can handle it? It might be stressful, expensive, exhausting." I realized she was planting doubt, weaving guilt into the excitement. And instead of reacting as I always had, apologizing, shrinking, I simply nodded. "I can manage," I said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Over the next days, she escalated. Casual comments about my finances, suggestions that I might be overestimating my abilities, offhand remarks about how Mark had handled similar situations flawlessly. I noticed how carefully she used comparison, always placing me against him, always measuring me against the golden standard I could never reach. I stopped reacting. I documented every word, every glance, every insinuation in my journal. This act alone was empowering. Each entry felt like a small act of resistance, a reclaiming of memory from the distortion she tried to impose on reality. Mark, as usual, did nothing. He never took sides, never defended me, never acknowledged that the manipulation existed. In fact, his indifference became part of my plan. I realized that the golden child's obedience was a tool I could exploit. His silence made her overconfidence in control his own undoing. The real turning point came during a conversation I had been dreading for months. It was the kind of confrontation I had always avoided, convinced that speaking up would lead only to punishment. But now, armed with knowledge and observation, I felt a strange clarity. I said one evening, quietly, "I've noticed something. You speak to me differently than you speak to Mark. You praise him for small things, but when I do well, it's never enough. And sometimes it feels deliberate." She blinked. Surprised. Not angry. Surprised. "I don't know what you mean," she said softly, almost a whisper, as if testing the waters of disbelief. I continued, keeping my voice steady, "that you control how I feel. You twist what I do, what I say, what I think. And I've realized it's not normal. It's not love. It's manipulation." The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. I had expected her to deny, to dismiss, to gaslight me, but she didn't. She just studied me, her expression unreadable. "Are you serious?" she finally asked. I nodded. "I've been silent for years, but I've been watching, listening, understanding, and I'm not going to let you do this to me anymore." She didn't reply. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just went to her room and closed the door. That night, I lay in bed, heart pounding, but not with fear, with adrenaline, with recognition of my own power. For the first time, I felt that the invisible threads that had bound me were weakening. Over the next weeks, I tested the boundaries I had set. I went to the city for interviews without announcing every move. I chose my clothes without asking for approval. I laughed freely at home without fearing retribution. Each action was small, almost imperceptible, but cumulatively, it started to shift the dynamic. She responded in subtle ways. A sigh here, a raised eyebrow there, a casual remark about how independent I've become. Each one was a test. Each one was a sign that she noticed and that she was trying to regain control. But this time, I didn't flinch. Mark, meanwhile, began to notice a change in the atmosphere too. For the first time, he seemed uncomfortable. Not because I had done anything dramatic, because the script had changed. The silent compliance that had made our family function smoothly was gone. I wasn't the obedient child anymore. I realized something critical. Control had never been about what I did. It had been about my fear, my compliance. And once I stopped giving that to her, her power faltered. The next confrontation was subtle, almost mundane. She asked me to help with grocery shopping, using a tone that implied criticism. I said yes, but on my terms. I went when I wanted, returned when I wanted, and spoke only as much as I chose. She noticed, of course. She always notices. But she said nothing, which was worse than any argument. It was a quiet victory, a tiny, almost invisible reclaiming of autonomy. And yet, it felt monumental. For the first time in years, I could see the outlines of my life outside her influence. Every small act of independence built confidence, reinforced boundaries, and weakened the psychological chain she had wrapped around me. I was learning the paradox of silence. It could be imposed as punishment, or it could be chosen as strategy. I was using it now deliberately, not to hide, but to observe, to plan, to gather strength. And through it all, one truth became painfully, liberatingly clear. People who underestimate the silent ones do so at their own peril. The quiet are not always weak. The quiet are not always compliant. Often, the quiet are calculating, watching, waiting for the precise moment when the balance of power can shift. I didn't yet know exactly how far I would go or what the final confrontation would look like. But I knew this. The mask had begun to crack, and I was holding the hammer. The months that followed were a careful, deliberate dance. I had learned the rules of her manipulation, mapped every thread of control, and now I was beginning to pull at them, slowly, invisibly, with precision. Each act was small, answering a question on my own terms, refusing a subtle guilt trip, leaving the apartment without announcing my schedule. Each act was monumental in its own way because it meant I was choosing myself instead of shrinking to fit her expectations. It began with boundaries. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped editing my expressions, my laughter, my thoughts. She noticed immediately, of course, but she didn't have the usual weapons at her disposal. My compliance, the fuel for her control, was gone. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find her in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone, pretending calm. "You should tell me where you're going tonight," she said casually, testing the waters. "I'll be at the library," I said. "No apology, no hesitation." Her eyes flicked up, a faint tightening of her lips, and then nothing. She let it pass, unspoken, which was more alarming than any argument we'd ever had. Mark noticed too. For the first time, he seemed disoriented, unsure where his role fit in this new dynamic. He tried small interventions, soft jokes, half smiles, casual reminders of family rules, but I didn't respond the way I had before. I simply observed and adjusted. My silence was now deliberate, strategic, and more powerful than any words. The real breakthrough came when I confronted the patterns I had documented for years. One Saturday afternoon, I sat with my journal open, pages filled with careful notes of manipulation, gaslighting, and silent punishments. I read aloud, softly, each incident, each word, each subtle act of control, not to accuse but to expose. "You do this constantly," I said, voice steady. "You manipulate me. You twist my words. You reward Mark for things I do as well, but you never acknowledge me. And for years, I thought it was normal. But it's not." She stared, eyes wide. Not angry, Not defensive, just surprised. And in that moment, I realized something critical. She thrived on the assumption that I would never notice, never challenge, never act. And now I had. The shift was subtle at first. She started overcompensating, praising me for small tasks, making remarks about my maturity, attempting to reclaim influence with empty compliments. But I had learned to hear beyond words, to see beyond gestures. I could recognize manipulation even when cloaked in warmth. I began asserting myself more boldly. I accepted opportunities she had always dismissed. I set deadlines for my studies and work, ignoring her suggestions that I might fail. I spoke my mind in conversations at home without fear of immediate retribution. Each act chipped away at the carefully constructed hierarchy of control. One night, she cornered me in the kitchen, pretending casual concern. "I'm worried about you," she said softly, almost tenderly. "You seem different lately." I met her gaze without flinching. "I am different," I said. "I'm learning to take care of myself, and I won't let fear or guilt control me anymore." Her silence was palpable. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed I would continue to bend, to apologize, to shrink. But I didn't. I stood firm, calm, unshakable. The days that followed were a test of endurance for both of us. She tried subtle manipulations, comments about my choices, comparisons to Mark, quiet insinuations designed to sow doubt, but I had learned the art of observation without reaction. Her words no longer had the power to unsettle me. My silence was now armor, not submission. Mark's complicity became irrelevant. He tried to intervene at times, offering advice or subtle warnings, but I had reached a point where his presence no longer dictated my choices. The golden child, the perfect one, could no longer define my reality. The ultimate moment of liberation came quietly. I had been accepted for a position in a city across the country, a culmination of years of effort, skill, and determination that she had tried to downplay at every turn. Well, I told her I did so not with fear, not with hesitation, but with certainty. "That's great," she said, voice neutral. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I am," I said calmly. "I worked for it. I'm ready to move forward." She studied me, perhaps for the first time seeing me as an independent person rather than an extension of her control. She said nothing more. No manipulative comment. No subtle guilt trip. Just silence. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of my freedom. Moving day came. I packed my belongings, each item a small testament to my independence. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't apologize for leaving. I simply took my life with me. I left a note, not to justify myself, not to explain, but to state a fact. I am choosing myself. When I left, I didn't look back. The apartment, the silent punishments, the subtle manipulations, they no longer held sway over me. I had grown too strong, too aware, too deliberate. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that my mother and Mark were unsettled by my departure. They missed the quiet compliance they had always relied on. She had no control over me anymore, and that unease was the first real measure of justice. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need revenge. The subtle, ironic justice was in my autonomy, the quiet reclamation of my own life. My silence, once a tool of submission, had become my weapon. My observation, once a source of anxiety, had become my compass. For the first time, I existed fully for myself. I no longer measure my worth by her approval, no longer allowed guilt to dictate my choices, no longer tolerated the subtle erosion of my confidence. I had learned the truth that had been hidden for so long. People underestimate the silent ones because they mistake observation for weakness. But the silent ones remember. The silent ones plan. And the silent ones, when ready, act. I had been underestimated for years. And now, in the quiet victory of my independence, I realized just how powerful that underestimated strength truly was. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I didn't destroy. I simply walked away, and in doing so, I finally belonged to myself. Freedom didn't feel loud. It felt quiet, precise, complete. And that silence, once a source of fear and suppression, was the sound of my triumph.